Welcome everyone to the Royal Society. My name's Felicity. I run the History of Science lunchtime lectures here. And I'm very pleased to introduce to you today Dr. Peter Collins. Peter is a well-known figure around the Royal Society because he's the director of our Centre for History of Science, which is now what the Library and Archives and our other historical activities have all come under the umbrella of. So that's a very exciting initiative that we're celebrating this year, which of course, as you know, is our 350th anniversary. Peter's been at the Royal Society since 1981. He completed a doctorate in the history of science, but then worked for many years in the science policy section here. But of course has recently returned to his original interests in the history of science, and he's now writing the history of the Royal Society over the last 50 years. So it's a very topical talk. It's hot off the press, new research, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing about the presidential politics, the controversial election of 1945.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's nice to be back doing history, actually. I was about to say it's sort of rather safer than doing policy work. I may find out today that that's not true. And this is a story about something that turned out not to be terribly safe. In fact, it's a story about how the Royal Society chose who would be its next president in succession to Henry Dale in 1945. And I think the story is interesting because of what it tells us about the Society's values at a crucial time in its history. And it's interesting also because what it tells us about how the Society works, or worked then anyway. I may not deal with questions about how it still works, depending on what the questions are. So we learn a bit about the Society's sociology, and we get a sort of personal, up-close and personal insight into some really pretty major figures in history of science. The story also tells us about the law of unintended consequences, which dogs an awful lot of these things. By way of a bit more background, I should tell you that everybody I'm going to talk about is a fellow of the Society, so I won't mention that again. Just take it for granted that they're fellows and most of them are members of the Council, except those who aren't. I should also say that all of this is based on archival material, mostly here, some at the Imperial War Museum and one or two other places. So this is all put together from little bits of paper, as it were. Now, to follow the story, you need to know a bit about how things were supposed to happen. The Society is formally run by a council of 21 members, 10 of whom retire every year. Of those 21, 5 are called officers. There's a president and a foreign secretary who did then 5 years each. And then there's a treasurer and a biological and physical secretary who then did up to 10 years each. And the process would be that towards the end, the Society's year runs through to 30 November each year. And towards the end of the year, in the autumn, the existing council would assemble a slate of the 11 members who are going to stay on council and the 10 new people who are going to come on. And it would put that slate to a business meeting of the fellows. So all the fellows who could get to London and come to a meeting physically. And they would vote on the slate of 21 names on 30 November. And those 21 would then take up their jobs, their offices, their posts that evening. So that's how it was done. And the individuals would have been consulted beforehand, obviously, to make sure that they were going to accept. But the whole thing was tightly controlled, and the council, in effect, replicated itself without any formal consultation process. Now, in 1945, it so happened that 3 of the 5 officers were about to step down. It was badly organised. We do it much better now. So the president, Henry Dale, the biological secretary, A.V. Hill, and the foreign secretary, Henry Tizard, were all due to retire on 30 November 1945. So this threatened a major discontinuity in the Society's leadership, and that prospect was giving rise to a great deal of discussion within the Society. It wasn't just a purely private matter either, because the decisions that were being made about the next batch of officers were, in effect, decisions about what the Society was going to look like, what it was going to care about, what it was going to do in the post-war world. And there was a lot of interest on that, because it was obvious that the position of science in public life had changed a great deal in the previous decade or two, but obviously particularly during the war, and that this new status that science had would be consolidated in peacetime. But the growth of science, and especially the growth in public spending on science, brought with it the spectre of increased government control of science. The Royal Society as an organisation had kept a pretty low profile in all these debates about planning in science and about how to maximise the social benefits of public spend on science. But so the growing prominence of these issues was going to force it to get involved, or might force it to get involved in these debates. So that was a challenge. What was the Society going to do in the post-war world? Was it going to seek an active role, or would it stand to one side and comment occasionally, or would it immerse itself in fundamental science and stay out of all political discussion? Now, an early indication of this, and how far the Society might be prepared to go, was a project that was instigated by Patrick Blackett. That's him. There's a black and white picture that we have of him that's even more stern. But he provoked a study on the post-war needs of fundamental science. And a report on this, the Society took it up and published a report in January 1945, which argued for, of course, more spending on fundamental science and more money for the Society to spend on fundamental science, and some sort of advisory role for the Society. Blackett actually wanted the report to say that the Society should be the body that controlled and administered public spending on research. And the report did not do that. The Society wasn't prepared to go that far. So there were some sort of limits there already. Now, within the Society, there had been signs of impatience and with the amount of control that Council had in the way that I just described. And in 1935, there had been a Fellows' Revolt led by Frederick Soddy, which tried to get Council to loosen up a bit and to have a more democratic process. That failed, but it continued to simmer underneath. So in 1945, you've got a situation where some of the fellows are getting restless. You've got these big issues about the future of the Society. You've got 3 out of 5 officers about to step down, a slight sense of crisis building up. And all you need is some fellow prepared to stir it. Let me introduce Edward Neville DeCosta, Andrade, physicist, luckily known as Percy, makes it much easier. He'd been elected to the Society a month after the petition in 1935 had been submitted to Council. He was on Council from 1942 to the end of 1944. And in that vantage point, he heard the whispers, the rumours in the corridors about possible people for the next presidency. And he didn't like what he heard. So, either ignorant of or ignoring Frederick Soddy's failed petition, he thought that he would try and repeat the experience. Now, while you're on Council, you can't very well draft a petition to Council. But he produced a quiet draft and tried it out on one or two people, including Blackett and including Tizard. I'll come back to that in a minute. And he claimed that while he was on Council, he'd often heard regrets that fellows did not more frequently let Council know what they are thinking. So he decided to see if they actually meant that. So he got encouragement from Blackett. This would be a fun thing to do. And as soon as he stepped down from council, so at the end of November 1944, he did some more work on his petition, and he then started collecting signatures for it. So by mid-January, he got 10 fellows to sign it. I say petition, he called it a memorial. You've got to get used to some of the 1945 languages, so his memorial. By the middle of February, he had got 50 fellows to sign it. And when he finally sent it in on the 19th of March, he had 84 fellows sign it. You might be able to read that if you're sitting in the front row. Let me tell you a bit about the 84. They weren't a random cross-section of the fellowship. They were his friends and friends of friends and contacts. Because he wrote to each one of them, or he spoke to each one of them. It wasn't a mass mailing, it was one by one by one. This is still wartime, pre-email. It's a lot of work he did, which is excellent because there's a lot of letters, and we have some of them. And my thanks, I should say at this stage, to my colleague Keith Moore, who suddenly from the bowels of nowhere produced a large brown envelope saying we were given this in 1971 and nobody's looked at it. It had all the letters in it. And that's the basis of a fair amount of this story now. So these 84 fellows, half had been elected to the society in the previous 10 years, so since the Soddy revolt, compared with 40% of the fellowship as a whole. So at that level, it's sort of more or less representative. 3/4 were physical scientists, as opposed to about half the society being physical, half biological. That reflects the fact that Andre was a physicist. And about 70% were based in the Golden Triangle, compared with, again, about half the fellowship as a whole. So that's this lot. And there'll be names that you've never heard of, and there'll be some that you recognise. Now, although he did it terribly carefully, and whenever he approached someone who wrote someone, he was always in confidence and keep this to yourself and so on, this wasn't about catching the leadership off guard. It was about being discreet rather than being secret. And just to make sure that he was behaving properly. He went to great lengths to behave properly, which is interesting as the story develops. So he discussed it with A.V. Hill, who had been a biological secretary for 9 years then. He knew it. He was the man. So he consulted him, but as a wise friend, not as an official, so that Hill could answer as a friend instead of having to give the correct answer. And he also consulted Charles Sherrington, who had been president in the 1920s and was a close friend of Andre's, strong supporter. And he said to Sherrington that Hill considers our action a perfectly proper and constitutional one, welcomes it, and thinks we are doing the society a service. If A.V. Hill thinks that all is well, I do not think there can be much wrong. So he was sort of gathering legitimacy to himself and to his memorial. And he told the head of the society staff. So it wasn't secret in that way. But getting Sherrington's support and A.V. Hill's backing in that way was a great fillip for him. And he could tell when he approached people to see if they would sign, he could say, look, there is, of course, in one of the letters, there is nothing irregular or Bolshevistic in the Fellows' Memorialising Council. It's lovely language here. So, what Andre was doing, he wanted to see the society actively engaged in public life. He wanted an organisation to speak for British science as a whole, and he was worried that the society would fall short of that aspiration if they elected the wrong president. And a lot of fellows agreed with that, without necessarily agreeing with the existence of the memorial or the details of it. And just to sort of build up a bit of conspiracy here, one of the people who did sign it, Dudley Newitt, told Andre, I have had the impression during recent years that there have been influences at work in political circles which have tended to deprive the society of its rightful place in national affairs. and there could be no better time than the present to deliver a counter-attack. We can discuss later what he meant by all that, but there was that sort of spirit going on, that environment. Some people were getting worried about the society getting too politicised, so Andre says to them, look, none of us wants to see the Royal Society a political body, though we do want to see it speak for science when the politicians want advice. And the memorial argued that the Society should assume its just place as the voice of British science and exercise that guiding influence on the scientific aspect of our national well-being which was contemplated by our founders. And he agreed with Dudley Newitt that the Society had lost ground in recent years and had to make it up. Otherwise it would just be left to government departments to speak for science, and that, of course, would be disastrous. Ironically, when you then said to him, well, what are these big policy issues that the Society's got to get involved with? His answer was, we need a new building. Now, that was a big talking point for the Society, and it continued to be a big talking point for the next 20 years. But you wouldn't nowadays think that's the biggest issue on the total agenda and merits all this effort. And one of the people who refused to sign his memorial said to him, look, the Society ought to be capable of sorting out its building even if the president was in the last terminal stages of decay. I mean, it's slightly disproportionate action. So maybe he wasn't actually, either he didn't have an example or he wasn't letting on what he was actually on about there. So the memorial then, and this all focuses then on the person of the president. And the memorial spells out in great detail the attributes expected of the president if he was going to deliver all these great results. He should have knowledge of the machinery of government and of government procedure, and not stand in undue awe of the leading figures in government and administrative circles. He should be accustomed to presenting the case for science or for particular aspects of science to political ears, and he should have considerable international experience. He should also, of course, be energetic, sufficiently young in spirit to handle both opposition and apathy, a good speaker, and of high academic status. Now, this is the big issue. If you can't find such a paragon, are you prepared to compromise on high academic status in order to get the other qualities? And high academic status in the first draft meant Nobel or thereabouts. They then said, why should we let the Swedes decide who our president is? So they switched that to the Copley Medal. And that's an interesting one, because all presidents then, the previous 10 and the next 10, either had the Copley Medal before they became president or got it afterwards. So Copley was the Royal Society's gold standard, as it were, for really, really, really good scientists. So do you have to have a Copley medalist, or can you have someone who's pretty damn good, but can also hold his own in Whitehall? And that was the big issue. And he was saying, Andre was saying, well, okay, I quite agree, we have to have a Copley medalist, but the times are really quite exceptional now, and this is just a one-off, and. And people said, well, suppose it worked, we'd then get used to it, that could be a problem. Or one other person said, look, the times truly are critical, but I cannot remember any time when they were not, which is a fair comment. Now, why was Andre actually alarmed by all this? He was alarmed because the people he had heard mentioned in the corridors while he was on council, there were two in particular. One was G.I. Taylor, the physicist, and the other was Robert Robinson, the chemist. And both unimpeachably brilliant scientists. Neither of them likely to support any activist vision of what the society should be. And Andre tarred them both with the same brush. He said neither of them is a good speaker. I hate standing up saying they weren't good speakers. I've been exposed. Neither of them is a good speaker. Neither of them is particularly a man of affairs. Neither of them would, I feel, give sufficient attention to the affairs of the society. Then he goes on, not very convincingly, I have not a grain of personal feeling against Taylor or Robinson. I'm thinking solely of the society. He protested too much. He told quite a lot of his closer friends that Robinson in particular was temperamentally unsuited for this particular post. Now, given that Robinson was extremely eminent, Nobel laureate and all the rest of it, and he had his Copley Medal by then, and he was on council and therefore intimately involved in the whole selection process, running a campaign against him is a bit tricky. Now, not only did Andrade not want Taylor or Robinson as president, he did want Henry Tizard, who was then beginning his fifth and final year as Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society, and who had, of course, unparalleled Whitehall experience. What he didn't know was that actually Tizard was trying to get out of the work he was doing already for the Royal Society and wanted to cut down his engagement. When Andrade sent Tizard his very, very early pre-draft of the memorial in October 1944, while he was still on council, and it was so subtly phrased that Tizard didn't realise that it was actually a plug for him. Now, Andrade's whole point in doing the memorial was to stop people on council saying when Tizard's name comes up, well, the fellowship wouldn't wear it. So you want to be able to say, yes, the fellowship would wear it. That's the point of the memorial. So when he sort of realised that people were misinterpreting what the memorial said, he then put Tizard's name in it explicitly. This paragon of a president with all these attributes, such a man is Tizard. And he did that in February, early February. Tizard, of course, was horrified and told him so. Andrade tried to sort of soothe him down and say, look, this is meant to help you and stop people saying the wrong thing about you. But mentioning names was a big issue. Now, we'll come back to that in a minute. Early in the process, Sherrington had warned Andrade that the memorial must not be seen as an attack on the officers, and particularly as an attack on the current. If you start saying this is what we need in the next president, it's terribly easy for that to be raised as an attack on the previous one. So you've got to be very, very careful. We all love Henry Dale. Don't knock him. Don't hold a pistol to council's head. So the final version of the memorial is beautifully deferential, praises the current marvellous regime, and says at the end, we hope it will be clear to Council that our action is dictated solely by a wish to aid and not to embarrass Council in the extremely difficult task which it has before it, and that we shall loyally accept whatever decision Council may make in this critical matter. Couldn't be more polite. Privately, he couldn't be less polite. As rumours swept to and fro and the paranoia built up during February, he's corresponding with one of his supporters, one of the signatories, Chibnall, and he's tried to set up a meeting to discuss some very queer developments that make our action all the more necessary. And Chibnall has also heard of some developments that he thinks is going to hand over the presidency on a plate to Geoffrey Taylor. Andrade's heard some different rumours, and he still can't fix up a meeting, so he writes another letter a couple of days later. I think that the prefects are going to try to put in AVH, he says, AV Hill. By a manoeuvre that I will describe to you when we meet, they have practically arranged that he shall succeed Dale at the Royal Institution, where Dale is to have 2 more years. I think that it is time that we began priming the members of council. I do not think that the prefects will stop at anything. There's a lot more I could say if only we could meet. Please destroy this letter. There's gorgeous stuff. So, rumours swirl. Now, of course, the prefects, by which Andrade meant the officers, or the people running the show, which is officers plus a few. They were actually as divided as any other group of fellows about the relative merits of the various individuals and about this key issue about whether scientific achievement is the only criterion or whether you're allowed to balance it with other criteria. And there was, ironically, there was certainly no preferred establishment candidate at that stage. But the prefects were united on the need to avoid personal embarrassment to individual members of council and to avoid any repeat of having a publicly contested election as they had in 1935. Now, three of the officers were party pre in this, so it was difficult for them to act. One of them that wasn't was the physical secretary, Jack Edgerton, an engineer. We don't have a picture of him, I'm afraid. But he, first of all, he had a private meeting with Andrade in the middle of February, saying, look, you've got to... Sorry. You've got to take Tizard's name out. And he thinks that Andrade has agreed, but the name stayed in. So what Edgerton did next, a couple of weeks later, was to get together all the members. It was council who was ultimately going to making these decisions. So he gets together the members of council that weren't party pre. Come and have lunch at my flat in South Ken, and we'll talk this over. And so the first of these meetings is on the 1st of March 1945, and he briefs them. He tells them about the memorials. This is going on now. This is going to hit us. And then they start with a list of 10 possible names for president. And by the end of the meeting, on the criterion of scientific excellence, they've identified Taylor and Robinson as the leading people on the physical side, and Edgar Adrian and A.V. Hill being just as strong scientifically, but on the biological side. And there's another discussion about whether you have to alternate physical and biological. And then what Jack Edgerton called administrative acumen. He said, if you're going to deal with that, either it is part of the president who can or cannot deliver it, or you could invent a new post called chairman of committees or something like that, and separate that from the presidency so you get it done by somebody else. And that meeting also thought that if A.V. Hill doesn't become president, then he'd make a jolly good foreign secretary. Of course, Tizard, you remember, was the foreign secretary at the time, and he was standing down. So Edgerton then goes along and tells Henry Dale all about that a couple of days later. Dale says, look, we ought to go for the strongest scientific candidate, and he wasn't at all happy about the idea of separating chairing things from being president. And Edgerton then goes around and talks to the council members who couldn't come to his meeting, and then he has a further meeting of the same sort with a similar cast on the 23rd of March. And by then he's saying, look, actually, we ought to keep Tizard in the frame. We shouldn't lose him, even though it would be a break with the traditional focus on scientific excellence. So by the end of that meeting on 23rd of March, you've got 5 people in play: Adrian, Hill, Robinson, Taylor, and Tizard. Tizard, who of course couldn't go to these meetings, tells Adrian that his choice would be Geoffrey Taylor, or even better, A.V. Hill. So you see that there's only a very mild commitment to the physical-biological alternation. And there were other conversations that we can trace between members of council. One of the members of council, for example, Bill Hodge, who later became physical secretary, has a discussion with Blackett, whom we already met, worrying about stepping away from the unique criterion of scientific excellence, saying that the president's main job is to symbolise the society's devotion to fundamental science before every other consideration. between Robinson and Taylor, he prefers Taylor. And quite interestingly, William Hodge says of Robinson that he would want to take part in all the business of the society, whether he knew it or not, whereas Taylor would want to do as little as possible, but would take the trouble to get up just those things which he had to do. And I think that would be an admirable kind of president to have. Blackett agrees that Taylor would be much better than Robinson. The more I see of Robinson, the more I get the idea that he has a considerable degree of cantankerousness about him. Both Hodge and Blackett wanted to rearrange the society's work so less depended on the president. We've seen that Blackett wanted the society to get more involved in running UK science. It certainly couldn't all depend on the one man that you happen to have. And he wanted much more responsibility to delegate it down to the vice presidents, to a chairman of council or general purpose committee, to sectional or other committees, and enlightened man that he was, to an enlarged and higher calibre staff. And Adrian and Hill agree with that. So there's quite a strong swell of support for stop making the president do everything and stop expecting him to be capable of doing everything. Now, Andre's memorial was formally circulated to council on the 4th of April. And by that time, they had... it was interesting. It was sent in late March, and the two officers, Edgerton and A.V. Hill, physical biological secretaries, saw that Tizard's name was still in there. Tizard said, if that stays, I'm resigning from council and you can't ever talk about me again, which would, of course, defeat the point of the memorial. So the secretaries took it out and drafted a letter with Andre to all the signatories saying, we've taken out that final paragraph. So by the time it got formally to council, you can pretend it doesn't exist until you present it formally. And they got it formally on the 4th of April, and by then it was, I don't want to say neutered because that's the wrong word completely, but it was in a form in which you could actually have a discussion about it. With Tizard's name in it, you couldn't discuss it because the principal man wouldn't tolerate him. So they sort of cleaned it up, and it went round to council then. At that point, council has to do something. You can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore. So the first time at which they can do that is the 19th of April. And just to make it really fun, Hill, Robinson, Tizard were all members of council, and they were all present at that council meeting. The report of that council meeting is that many members of council were strongly supportive of Tizard and thought he'd be a great president, but that Tizard, along with a good many other fellows, was still deeply irritated by the memorial and refused to have his name discussed by council. So what happens next is that Robinson on council says, I know, let's have A.V. Hill. Now, Hill had already been an officer for 10 years, and he didn't want to get mixed up in what he called this unpleasant business. And secondly, he actually wanted to go and do some science, and he hadn't done any for the last 10 years. So he said he didn't want to be considered. And then, as Hill recalled in a note, Robinson's name was mentioned, and he tactfully expressed his doubts, saying that he wanted to spend the rest of his life on research. So that's as far as they got at that first council meeting. And then people's views began to develop a bit more, and Blackett began to think that Tizard would actually be better than Taylor, and either of them clearly better than Robinson. Blackett was arguing that Tizard's science was actually jolly good. It's just that it was secret because it was wartime stuff, and therefore you couldn't talk about it, so he was really much better than you understood. And another council member wrote to Tizard to say, look, there'd be real regret if you withdraw your name. Please stay. We can lighten the burdens of office to make it all possible. Now, when Andrade first approached Tizard, he didn't understand what he was talking about. The second time he approached him, he thought, hang on a minute, if you actually mean me, that's ridiculous. By early May, he was willing to concede privately to Henry Dale. I realise I must take seriously the mention of my name and must not dismiss it as ridiculous. These are strange times which call for unusual decisions. Though I realise my own shortcomings acutely, it would be rather cowardly to decline to act if it really were the wish of the society that I should do so. So is Havering. But he's only prepared to do it if really the great majority of council sort of beg him to do it, and he's absolutely not prepared to have a contested election. So, next meeting of council is 17 May, and when you get to 17 May, the president, trying to organise this herd of cats, he finds that 3 strongest candidates are all members of council, and they're all present at the meeting, and they've all said that they don't really want to do it. And to up the ante, both A.V. Hill and Robert Robinson then send in formal letters withdrawing their names from further consideration, and which Dale has to read out loud to council, and which council accepts. And Robinson's letter explicitly and against Dale's pleading highlights Andrade's memorial as the reason that he doesn't want to do it, because Robinson feels that the memorial is aimed at deprecating the choice of himself. He was right. Which would, of course, made his position impossible or extremely difficult if he had been elected. Council kept Tizard and Taylor in the frame. And then Tizard's supporters on council made such a strong case for him being the next president that a vote at that point would have handed him the nomination by a very large majority. But they'd run out of time. They hadn't had a chance to make the opposite case for Taylor, so the matter was left in suspense. Next council meeting, 14 June, you've got to stop Tizard bolting between the May meeting and the June meeting, so you can then elect him at the June meeting. But Tizard then starts hearing gossip, interpreting the memorial as advocacy for himself. That can't have been a surprise. But I suppose it reaches a level where it becomes impossible for him to pretend anything else. And Dale sort of really sympathises with the embarrassment of having your claims advocated by a bunch of interfering busybodies, begs him not to let that get in the way. And writes, it's almost incredible that this signature of a memorial by a few fellows, most of whom them well-meaning and few, if any, deliberately mischievous, could have done so much harm. If these idiots had not meddled, you would have been president by now. But it falls on deaf ears. And by the beginning of June, even though he's got most of council behind him, Tizard hardens his attitude and writes back to Dale with an adamant refusal to be considered further. And that's that. Dale writes to Hill, we have to accept the situation. Never in the long history of our presidential elections has so much mischief been caused for so many by so few. So that's the end of Tizard. We ought to move on, but we'll leave him up there for a bit longer. What might have been, you know. So the memorial, setting out to achieve all these things, had achieved the result that the 3 of the 4 main candidates, Hill, Robinson, Tizard, dropped out and refused to be considered. Unintended consequences. That just left Taylor, who was nobody's idea of an active president. And Hill writes to Tizard to say how sorry he is about all this and how dreadful politics is. Hill also writes to Andrade and blames him for this outcome. And he starts getting worried himself that he might end up as Foreign Secretary living in London with a President Taylor living in Cambridge doing nothing, and Hill then having to do all the work, which is exactly the opposite of what Hill was trying to achieve, which was to get back to his lab. So Dale tells council members, look, it's all gone wrong. It's all gone pear-shaped. Meeting on 14 June, let's not talk about it anymore. This is bad news. Let's just leave it. Come back in July. We'll talk about it in July. So they come back in July. Now, on the eve of that meeting, so on the 11th of July, you've got one name in the frame who nobody really thinks is quite it. So Edgerton then says, well, Taylor's brilliant leading physicist. His election will be normal, therefore, and not lead to any faction, and a charming man. But we probably ought to have a choice. 2 is a better number than 1 for an election in this context, at least for a discussion in this context. So he suggests, well, let's pull up N.V. Sidgwick, chemist. He's 72, so 13 years older than Taylor, but experienced, much admired and respected abroad. So we now have 2 names in the frame. And he had been kicked around in some of the earlier discussions as well, in Edgerton's flat. So council meets at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Officers have a discussion in the morning about various things, then they meet for lunch, off the record. And they start discussing the presidency. They continue discussing the presidency. They've done little else for months. And then they think, hang on a minute, if we're going to put up a chemist, and it's not Robinson, then we're going to have Robinson to deal with. We should at least warn Robinson where we are with Sidgwick and Taylor. So they warn Robinson. You can almost see it on the way into the council meeting. And Robinson said, well, bloody hell, in that case you can put my name back in. So they do. So now you suddenly have 3 names. Now what are you going to do with 3 names? And this is one of the sort of odder processes. You don't vote on all 3 names. You vote on them in pairs, right? So you put the 2 chemists against each other. Sidgwick against Robinson. Robinson wins by 10 votes to 8. Of the 21 members of council, 2 were missing, so that leaves 19, and Robinson was kicked out of the room. And actually what's interesting is that Dale takes Robinson out of the room and goes and sit over there. And as he does that, he says to Robinson, I don't think they're going to elect you. He doesn't say anything else. So Robinson beats Sidgwick 10 to 8. Then it's Robinson Taylor. I think Dale must have voted in the first vote, but doesn't vote in this one. Robinson beats Taylor 9 votes to 8. It's about as close as it could be. And what then happens is that you then say to council, okay, it's Robinson by 9 to 8. Now then, can we vote on Robinson? One name. Yep. All in favour say aye. They all say aye. So he is elected unanimously by 1 vote. You can then go out and say to him, you have the unanimous vote of council. Because as Dale explains later to other people, look, we actually, because of this process, you never know how close you were. You never really know what the other fellows think of you. Take that home. It's probably just as well, too. So, and he then gets a formal letter of invitation and he accepts by return, and that's that. Edgerton, so that's as close you get to as close as you get to a smiling Robinson, at least in our archives. So Edgerton's disappointed, but says, well, okay, well, at least they've made A.V. Hill for Foreign Secretary again, so I can work with him for an extra year, and that's fun. Robinson writes to Tizard, I was genuinely surprised, he lied, and overwhelmed of the outcome because I was not well informed about the way the events were shaping themselves. I have accepted the nomination. If elected, I shall owe this success chiefly to your support, and I shall never forget your large-hearted and generous conduct. It's a complicated sort of letter, isn't it? And David Pye, who had tried to keep, council member who had tried to keep Tizard in the frame, then later acknowledges that Tizard had actually taken the only course that he could, I suppose you were right about the PRS affair. Indeed, the line you took probably was the only possible one as things worked out, but it made me very sad that the misdirected zeal should have prevented what I'm certain a large majority would have liked to happen, and which would have occurred if things could have been left to take their normal course. So, the outcome of all that then. First of all, Robinson's election seemed to signal a future for the Society as a body devoted to fundamental research and maintenance of highest possible standards in fundamental research, and as a body devoted equally to its own independence. That's really important. It might on occasion be willing to give advice, but strictly on its own terms. So that at least gives you an answer about whether the Society is willing to compromise on the scientific stature in order to get policy relevance. Ironically, the one policy issue on which Robinson as president did fight vigorously was the one that Andrade had highlighted to the potential signatories, that about getting new housing for the Society. And he developed a huge detailed plan for all this, and in the end he was thwarted by other people within the Society and by his successor president, who thought it was all stupid. So that's a nice irony there, and Robinson was still grumpy about the fact that his plans failed, and 30 years later he was still complaining about it. So that's Robinson. Now, Andrade's memorial, it's a salutary reminder of how of the law of unintended consequences. And he had done his homework. He'd kept the prefects informed all the way along. He wasn't going behind their backs. He got the big names on side, and you saw some of them. Many fellows, including many on council, were sympathetic to his wish to see the Society actively engaged in public life. And there was considerable appetite among the fellowship for the Society to assume its just place as the voice of British science and exercise that guiding influence on the scientific aspect of our national well-being that the memorial had sought. So Andrade he'd done it all carefully. He was justified in not relishing the prospect of Robinson as president. Andrade had done 2 years on council. He should have known how things worked by then. Now, whether or not Tizard actually wanted the presidency, he certainly understood. Tizard certainly understood that open campaigning for the presidency, even when it's done by somebody else, is not the way to secure high office. And he would have been horrified at the thought that fellows might have thought that he was inept enough to have instigated the campaign on his own behalf. So although his name was eventually excised from the memorial, of course by then everybody had read it. All the people who signed it, all the people who refused to sign it, all the people who had their ears to the ground knew about it. So it would have been very difficult to have dealt with a rumour that he wanted the job too much, which is an interesting concept, actually. Now, once council, however narrowly, and it doesn't get much narrower than it did, once they've come down on one name and they've then gone through the process of giving him unanimous support, that person then comes in with authority and can be presented publicly with authority and can act for the next 5 years with authority. The memorial threatened such courtesies by disrupting the discreet deliberations of officers and council. And that's why it created so much embarrassment, exacerbated by the fact that quite a lot of the people being discussed were members of council themselves. And it made it really awkward. This is England 1945. It might not be all that different now. You can think about that. So it created an awful lot of embarrassment. Now, the downside of the way the Society normally handled these things, of course, was that the general fellowship could easily feel excluded from it all. And one of the signatories complained to, one of those who did sign, complained to Andrade, "It is made so difficult for any fellow to influence the decisions that are taken in the name of the Society as a whole, that most fellows seem to lose interest. Unless council can modify the constitution in such a way as to make itself a council appointed by the fellows, rather than one acting as though it were divinely ordained, the outlook for the society is not very bright, even if we have a president who can deal with politicians. So these issues at that level remained unresolved. Now, being a signatory to the memorial might have thought to, if you end up on the losing side, you might be thought to be heading to an early grave. In fact, that was not the case. It was not the prelude to automatic banishment. Both Sidgwick and Salisbury, the man who then became biological secretary, signed the petition. And there were other famous signatories, or other people who went on to become famous, people like Harry Massey, who ran the Society's space research. Harry Melville became president of DSIR. Solly Zuckerman, I'm sure you all know. And you might have noticed Howard Florey on the list. He became president 15 years later, 1960. And he then set about doing all the activist things that he had been petitioning for earlier. And ironically also, it was he who finally cracked the housing issue. So it's a story full of ironies. A.V. Hill, I would say leaping for joy at not having got the presidency, but in fact the date gives the lie to that. He did 1 year as Foreign Secretary and then handed that post on to Edgar Adrian. And then, now at last I can go and do some proper academic work, but then Jack Edgerton broke his leg in a skiing accident, was out for 6 months, so then A.V. Hill, physiologist, became Physical Secretary for 6 months, and then finally got back to doing some work. But he later mused. It was Adrian who was Foreign Secretary till 1950, and then Adrian became President. And Hill thought, well, if I'd stayed Foreign Secretary for those other 4 years, I might have been President. And he was obviously a touch wistful about it. But then he thought, well, look, Adrian did a perfectly good job. I've done some decent science, and I've got the companion of honour, so I don't need the OM as well. Now then, let's finish with Adrian, the well-intentioned Percy Adrian. He was chairman of the Royal Society Library Committee from 1944. He remained in that post, and it clearly suited him, as you can see, until his death in 1971, and Robinson made him honorary librarian in 1948. So there's a nice little touch there. He later went to work at the Royal Institution, tried to carry out reform there, failed comprehensively, got thrown out, and then ended his days as a research consultant. But he then, towards the end of his life, he remarked ruefully to Harold Hartley, who had just written Tizard's biographical memoir. "I had a very high opinion of Tizard," said Adrian. Well, we realise that. "I tried to get him elected PRS in 1945. The times were exceptional. As it turned out, I merely did myself harm and the society no good. Reform can be a hazardous business." Thank you very much.